Good afternoon. I had occasion to play a classical USCF-rated game last night. I had some time off from work that I hadn't taken, and if I don't use it before the end of the year, it's going to disappear. So I decided I'd take last night off and next Wednesday, which means I get to play two USCF-rated games of chess. And in this game, I was paired against Stephen Murray, rated in the 1700s, and Steve is a player I consider underrated. I've been trying to help him improve at chess, and I think he has been improving, and I think he's been improving more on his own than with my help. Um, but the point is, I consider him underrated. And going into this game, I thought, well, the worst pairing I can get is Steve Murray, because he's probably playing at a strength at least a couple hundred points higher than his rating. And wouldn't you know it, I got paired against him. And I got the black pieces. He led with e4, I played e5, bishop c4, knight f6. He and I have played this variation at least once before. d4, e takes d4, knight f3. And I think here, at some point in the past, I played knight takes e4. But right after that game, Paul Godin pointed out to me that if you play knight c6 here, you transpose into what I think is the main line of the Scotch Gambit. And it's normally reached this way. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, bishop c4. And here black plays knight f6. Well, over here, where are we? In the game, I brought the knights out, but I did it in the opposite order. So it turns out that in this position, by playing knight c6, which is what I played, we transpose into the Scotch Gambit. And normal here for white, I think, is to go e5, which is met by d5, an important resource for black to avoid having this e5 move be, let's say, too negatively impactful. And black's idea is if his knight gets captured on f6, of course the bishop's going to be captured on c4. So white usually plays bishop to b5 here. Black moves the knight to e4. White gets his pawn back. Black guards the c6 square. And white gives up the two bishops in exchange for damaging black's pawn structure. The game goes on from here. I don't really remember any more of it, but this is not what happened in the game. Instead, Steve played knight takes d4. This hasn't been played very much, at least in the database available for free on Lichess. And in the 6 or 7 times it's been played, white hasn't won a single game. Now, there are very few games, so I wouldn't read into that very much. But maybe we can take something from the fact that there aren't very many games, meaning that maybe at a high level, white doesn't usually play this way. I played bishop to c5. What else was I considering here? Oh, bishop e7 is not really an option here, because now after e5, if I use my d5 resource, after e takes f6, d takes c4, there's another piece for white to capture on e7, so black would be losing there. And I considered knight takes e4. This is another resource to be aware of in double e-pawn openings. And the idea is you're putting your knight on an open file with your king still in the center of the board, which looks really dangerous and frankly is. But you're going to play d5 to simultaneously defend the knight and attack the bishop on c4, and hopefully barely get castled before you get murdered in the middle of the board. Instead, I played bishop c5. Steve traded on c6. I think this was the only move to look at here. White might as well damage black's pawn structure. I took back with the b-pawn. White played knight c3. I forget which opening it is. It's probably a double e-pawn opening, but somehow you can get to this kind of pawn structure. It's not from the Scotch Gambit, but there's another way to get to this structure, and I know that black, a big idea for black in that variation is to put the bishop on b7. And so I had that in the back of my mind for the opening and middle game against Steve. He played knight c3. He might have wanted to play e5, but then black has the option to go knight e4 and put a bunch of pressure on the f2 square. So he played knight c3, which covers the e4 square. I castled, he castled. Okay, so both players breathed a sigh of relief here because they weren't going to get checkmated in the middle of the board. I played rook e8, simply trying to capture the pawn on e4, and he defended it with rook e1. All right, my next move took me, I think, quite a long time because I was very tempted to go bishop to b7. And my thought was, he might play e5, and I might play d5, and then after knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d5, I was hoping to demonstrate compensation for the pawn somehow. And what I was thinking of doing is playing c6. But that, of course, is very bad for the bishop on b7. But I thought it might be worth it because he's very vulnerable on the f2 square, and so maybe the queen can hop out to b6 or to h4 to put some more pressure on that square. I'm not sure I thought about it all that much more beyond that. Maybe I was thinking about moving the d-pawn as well to reactivate the bishop on b7, or maybe to stick it on a6. But I think I started to get worried about bishop takes f7 check. Something like bishop f7 check, king f7, queen h5 check, king g8 to guard h7, and then e6, hitting the bishop on c5 and trying to cause problems for black's king in other ways. I think I got scared about this and decided not to go for it. And maybe this was just strategically bad anyway, putting the pawn on c6. So instead, I tried to make the move d6 work, but I had a lot of trouble figuring out what to do after e5. Kept calculating rook, I can't play rook takes e5 here, for example, because after rook takes e5, I'm down a rook since the d-pawn is pinned to the queen on d8. And if I take with the pawn, he could trade on d8 and play rook takes e5. I mean, maybe there's going to be some trouble on f2, I'm not sure. But there's no rook d1 check, and if this rook gets into black's 7th rank at some point, these pawns on the queen side are going to be easy targets. But I finally realized, while calculating here, after way too many minutes, that knight g4, protected by the bishop on c8, is a double attack. It hits the f2 square and the e5 square. So white may just be losing a pawn here. So I played it, and Steve played bishop to e3. And this is kind of a critical moment for me because white can cause black a lot of trouble by playing bishop g5. And I kind of expected that from him here. It pins the knight, of course, and if the queen moves out of the way, then the knight's going to be captured on f6, and black's kingside pawn structure looks awful. So I was trying to figure out what to do about that, and I was considering playing rook e5. I thought white would play bishop f4. I don't think h4 is a good idea here, because then after h6, the pin can't be maintained. So I thought he'd play bishop f4 instead, and then I was going to have to decide whether or not to repeat the position. Now, regardless of what I think of Steve's playing strength, his actual rating is in the 1700s, and so getting a draw by repetition here was undesirable. So I was even thinking about sacrificing an exchange. I considered the dark squared bishop for white a very important piece because of how annoying this pin is, and the fact that this knight is defending the king side, and so this bishop having the power to remove the knight and to pin it makes it a very valuable minor piece. And so I thought, well, maybe I can just give up an exchange in order to get this dark squared bishop off the board. And so maybe I will make some move here with the queen, like queen e7, and then take back on e5 and try to dominate on the dark squares and use my two bishops and make up for the fact that I'm down an exchange. But Steve didn't do that. He played bishop to e3 instead. So this was obviously a welcome sight. I considered the dark squared bishop very important strategically for white, and so one of my major goals with black was to remove it from the board. Um, but it took me a while to figure out what to do here, because there's an interesting option for black, and that's to play knight takes e4. Just to show some variations, if knight takes e4, rook takes e4, bishop takes c5. I could take the bishop on c4 maybe, but if I don't have anything else, I have rook takes e1 and then a recapture on c5. And black has emerged up a pawn, but has terrible pawns on the queen side. I thought this would be a little bit better for me if I were black, but who knows if I'm right about that or not. But it doesn't matter, because I found a variation that was much less appealing. And that is for white to capture on c5, and after knight takes c5, where was it? I think it was here, to play queen f3 with a double attack on c6 and f7. And I didn't analyze this part during the game, but looking at it since, I was thinking about d5, and that made me think maybe knight takes d5 and bishop takes d5 would make the position still excellent for white, because he has renewed the double attack. There's an undefended rook on a8, and there's an attack on the pawn on f7. So I didn't like knight takes e4, but that was okay, because since one of my goals was to trade off the bishop on the dark squares, I was happy to do that. Bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, and rook b8. Might have been worth considering for black moving this light squared bishop again here, just as I could have on the previous move, was it? No, 2 moves ago. Yeah, instead of playing d6, I could have played bishop b7, and I had another opportunity to move that bishop here. I don't think g4 is a good square, because white would be happy to play f3. So maybe b7 again, intending to put pressure on the long diagonal eventually. Play the move c5, and by having the bishop on b7, keep a decent amount of control over the d5 square. But I decided to play rook b8 instead, hitting the b pawn. And I was looking at some variations here that in hindsight I don't think work, but that seemed really good to me during the game. I thought maybe white would play b3, and then I was thinking about this knight on c3 being vulnerable, and considering playing the move knight g4. It hits the rook. It threatens queen h4 maybe to hit the f-pawn and the h-pawn. And it also threatens knight to e5, which will hit the bishop on c4. And there might be a queen f6 move at some point with a double attack on f2 and the knight on the long diagonal. Again, I don't think the variations worked the way I thought they did during the game, but this was what was on my mind. Instead, Steve played bishop to b3 to guard his b-pawn, which gets the bishop out of the way of a later knight e5, but leaves white with the problem that if this bishop ever moves, there's still a capture on the b2 square. And now it's not as simple as that, because if that bishop moves and the rook takes on b2, the bishop could move back to b3, and white might be winning an exchange by trapping the rook. But it was at least appealing from my point of view to know that if I could get that bishop out of there, rook takes b2 might be an option. I played c5, and it looks weird because I'm giving up the d5 square in the center. But I had in mind that I wanted to make use of rook takes b2 later, which means I probably wanted to play c4. I was also thinking about this knight ending up on e5, from which it would support c4. So I thought, well, I'll play c5 now. Strategically, it's a good thing to put the pawns on dark squares, because we have light squared bishops left on the board. And maybe I'll get an opportunity to play c4 later on. He played f3. Yeah, here was I thinking about e5? Maybe not in this position, because knight g4 probably just loses that pawn on e5. It's a double attack on the rook and the pawn. I thought I saw some opportunity for white to play e5 in the middle game. And I said as much to Steve after the game. But now that I look at it, I can't find it. So maybe I was wrong. F3 instead. And here another strange move from me. I played bishop b7. I wanted to do something with the bishop, and it no longer had access to the g4 square. So it wasn't so great on this diagonal anymore. But when it moves to b7, it's staring into a gigantic pawn chain. But I did it anyway for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted more control of the d5 square so that black is less likely to be able to use that square for his pieces. For example, imagine that a knight shows up on d5, and then there's a capture, and the queen takes back. There might be a problem for black on f7 if there's something else going on in the position. So the bishop helps control that square and prevent that from happening. Steve played queen e1. I was also thinking that since we have light squared bishops, it's a good idea for the queens to be controlling diagonals of the dark variety. So it makes sense for black's queen to show up on one of these squares, whoops, f6, g5, h4, and for white to kind of try to do the same thing, to move his queen over to the king side and control some dark squares. And that's, I think, what the idea was behind Steve's queen e1, so he played very well. I played knight h5. I don't want him to be able to play queen g3 or queen h4, so I took both of those moves away, covering h4 with the queen and g3 with the knight. All right, and this brings us to a critical moment in the game, a moment at which I suspect that a computer wants white to play knight d5. Basically, black just moved his knight away from controlling the d5 square, so it's a great opportunity for white to jump in and start using that square for his minor pieces. And I don't remember exactly what I intended to do here. Maybe queen g5? Just keeping an eye on things. You know, it's probably not great here. Earlier when my bishop was on c8, I was thinking about putting a queen on g5 and playing bishop h3 and knight f4. But now his knight's guarding f4 and my bishop's not on that diagonal anymore. So yeah, I'm really not sure how I would have continued had he played knight d5. Maybe I would have taken it with the bishop. Bishop takes d5. If he takes with his bishop, maybe there's rook takes b2. Maybe we are holding on to the rook. So I bet he can't do that, which means he probably has to take on d5 with the pawn, but that makes this bishop not a very good piece. Yeah, so I guess this is probably what I was going to do if he played knight d5. Instead, Steve tried an interesting pawn sacrifice. He saw that there was a fight for the dark squares on the king side. He saw that black's idea was maybe to bring the queen out, maybe to put the knight on f4. And that black would be able to cause problems that way, and he didn't want to be suffering for the rest of the game under this kingside attack, and with black having a better pawn structure with the pawns on dark squares and better rooks. So he decided to sack a pawn in order to turn things around, and I think that's a great idea. He played f4. Knight takes f4. And this looks ridiculous at first because it completely gives up the e5 square. But his idea is to go queen f2, which he did. And now, notice that he's ready to put 3 pieces on the f-file lined up against the f7 square. This is the kind of... I mentioned a couple times that I think Steve is stronger than his rating, and this is the kind of thing you see from stronger players. When they think they've got a bad position or they're getting the sense that things are getting worse and worse, they'll usually try to do something to turn things around, rather than suffer for the rest of the game. So he gives up a pawn here, in order to get a counterattack and to be the one calling the shots for a while, and in order to try to set up some kind of tactic to win the game. I played knight e6, the only move as far as I can tell. There's pressure on the f7 square, and we've got to block that, so knight g6 is not an option, or the bishop will take on f7 and then e8. So knight e6, excuse me. Rook f1. And here I almost played queen e7, but caught myself at the last moment, because my plan after knight d5 had been for a few moves to remove that knight with the bishop, but here it would have cost me a piece. The knight on e6 can't move because of the pin on the e-file. So I had to take a step back and spend some time thinking here, and eventually just played rook f8 instead of queen e7, intending to play queen e7 after rook f3 once there's no more heavy piece for white on the e-file. Rook f3, queen e7, and queen d2. I wasn't sure what Steve's idea was with queen d2, but it became obvious in a moment. I made a small improving move because I was running pretty low on time and thought that I should try to catch up on the clock a little bit. So I played bishop to c6. But now Steve revealed his point. He played knight d5, and his idea is after I take that knight, which I did, he'll take back with the queen. And now there's all sorts of pressure, at least indirectly, on the f7 square. It's very difficult for black to deal with that. Leading up to this position, I hadn't seen what I was going to do here. I was low enough on time that I thought, hopefully there'll be some way here to not lose the game. The issue here is that if we just make some move for black, white's going to go rook takes f7, rook takes f7, queen takes e6, queen takes e6, bishop takes e6. I think, right? Yeah, and now material will be equal as soon as this rook is removed from the board. And we're going to enter a king and pawn ending. If that's what white wants to do, we're going to enter a king and pawn ending, and white will only do that if he's got the better of it here, and he may with a quick route to the center of the board with his king. Excuse me. Looking at it now, though, I could have sworn during the game that I was worried about something more than this. Maybe I was seeing a ghost, but I could have sworn there was a way for white, if black responded badly, to just rip open the black position and win material. I don't see it now, so we'll continue. I found this move king h8 in this position as a way to relieve the pin so that if there's a rook takes f7 later, I can take that rook and then queen takes e6 doesn't pin anything. So I'll in a variation like that, I'll likely be up in exchange for a pawn. He played c3. He too was starting to get low on time, and this move makes sense because it stops rook b4 to d4, and it stops knight d4. I played knight g5. Could he have taken on f7 here? Well, no. If he takes on f7 in this position, again, I get an exchange for a pawn. Actually, I get the pawn back right away, so black would just be winning here. So I played knight g5, and now I was thinking that I'd like to go f6, putting another pawn on a dark square, and then move the knight back to f7, and then out to e5. And I thought if I can get that knight to e5 safely, it will never be removed from that square, and I'll have the move c4 to kind of take his light-squared bishop out of the game. And at that point, black, with the extra pawn and the much better minor piece, will be winning the game. He played rook to f4, guarding e4. I played f6. He played queen to f5. I continued with my plan, knight f7. We were both kind of low on time here and making moves somewhat quickly. Rook to h4, h6, and queen g6. And we've reached a critical moment at which I played the move knight e5, and white has to decide whether or not he wants to take on the h6 square. It turns out not to work, at least as far as I know. Because after rook takes h6, g takes h6, queen h7, there isn't a queen takes f6, as that would drop the queen, and if white takes the timeout to play rook takes f6, black will trade queens on h6. So, white could instead, after queen h7, move the queen out of the way somewhere and then try to play rook f3 to h3. But I thought I had calculated that there would be time for black to get the king or the queen or both out of the way. And then the fact that this black knight is guarding two g-file squares and the f-pawn is guarding another one makes it really hard for white to deliver the kind of checks he has to deliver to get something out of this. I think Steve agreed with me at this point because he did not capture on h6. He played queen to g3. But this is sort of the beginning of the end of the game because at this point White's attack has fizzled. And the knight has made it all the way to e5. In fact, it's kind of a picturesque position in that every single black unit is on a dark square against a light squared bishop. And with the knight on e5, as I mentioned earlier, now I have the option to play c4. That's what I did. Steve continued to play actively. He's a very good player. He played bishop d1, intending to bring this bishop up to f5, at which point if he could re-threaten a sack on h6, there wouldn't be a queen h7 at the end. I played rook takes b2. I thought I had time for that. He played bishop to g4. And I had very little time and was afraid of this bishop f5 idea, so I snapped that bishop off, though I suspect a computer would find a better way to do things, because that knight on e5 was a very good piece. Rook takes g4, and I played queen e5, offering the queen trade. And that allows white to take on g7, but black's already up 2 pawns, so it's a way of giving back one of the pawns in exchange for getting the queens off the board in a situation in which black's king is a little bit more vulnerable than white's. And he went for that. I guess he should have done something else, move the queen somewhere, but wherever he moves it, it's not going to be a very good piece. So it's understandable that he played rook takes g7. I played queen takes g3, and he has to take back with the rook, of course, to avoid losing it on g7. Rook takes a2, though, from black, and now we have 2, 4, 6 pawns for black and 4 for white. So white's in big trouble here. Rook to b1. I was kind of expecting rook g6 here, and I was thinking about king h7. And then, eventually winning this endgame with black. He played rook b1 instead, so I played rook g8, forcing a trade of rooks because moving it away allows a capture on g2, which is very bad for white. I think Steve may have missed this under time pressure and played rook f3, so I played rook g takes g2 check, king f1, and rook takes h2. It's often the case when you get rooks doubled on the 7th rank that when one of them captures a pawn and delivers check on the g file, it doesn't really matter which way the king goes, because either way, after you take the h-pawn as well, he's going to have to come back to g1. Either he's going to be on h1, so taking on h2 is a check, or he's going to be on f1, in which case putting your rook on h2 threatens a mate on h1. So he played king g1. I played rook a to g2 check, king f1, and king g7. Rook to b7, rook to a2, and now black once again is threatening mate. So king back to g1. King up to avoid a check here. I was kind of hoping he would take, and then I would play rook h to b2. Actually, maybe I would check him first and then play rook h to b2 so that there isn't the defensive move. That's not true. Sorry, I'm correcting myself on the fly here. All right, so he may not get checkmated here, but that was my idea anyway. I was going to go rook h to b2 to threaten checkmate. He played rook g3, king h5, rook b5, a move I hadn't even looked at, so I was lucky that it didn't turn out to do anything. I played c5, rook b7, rook h to b2, threatening mate and to trade rooks, so he had to accept the trade. Played rook h3, king g5, rook f3, rook e2. Just kind of a cleanup job here, and then the promotion of one of the black pawns. Rook takes e4, rook d1, king f4. Threatened mate there. Played rook e3 to grab the c-pawn. And then tried to escort the h-pawn in to become a queen. All right, and in this position after h2, Steve resigned. He doesn't have rook g5 because of the capture, but even if he did, there would be king f4, and there's no way to stop the rook winning h1 queen. So thank you for watching. I'm going to be back with one more game next week, and it was fun to get to play a classical USCF-rated game again. All right, take care, and congrats to Steve, who played an excellent game.